Hi, I'm Matt Reynolds with Packaging World Magazine, here to talk food labels, a new food pyramid, and the recent release of the 2025 to 2030 Dietary Guidelines for Americans, or DGA for short. True to form for us, we're going to try to look at this news through a packaging lens and get a feel for how these changes are going to impact packaging, packages, nutrition labels, and that sort of thing. So I'm here today with our longtime Packaging World legal side columnist, Eric Greenberg. So, Eric, welcome. Why don't you introduce yourself to our audience or the few members of our audience who haven't met you already?
Glad to. Thank you, Matt. Yes, I'm Eric Greenberg. I'm an attorney based in Chicago. We do food and drug regulatory compliance for food companies, food packaging companies. We do a lot of work with contract packagers and their clients as well. And as Matt mentioned, I've been the legal columnist for Packaging World for many years, and I'm very glad to be associated with you folks. And I'm happy to be here today to talk about this big development that can affect packaging and labeling in coming years.
Yeah, yeah, and it is a big development because so big that you actually devoted two columns to it. One kind of in anticipation of the news, and now one reacting to the news. So we'll kind of combine those together in our conversation
Sure.
today. But you and Dr. Robert Post, he's a buddy of yours, a friend of yours. He's also a former federal official who helped lead past DGA development. So the two
Exactly
of you
right.
kind of ruminated over and what was anticipated, and now that the actual release is out, now that it's realized, you guys are actually thinking about what the DGA looks like and what it means to brand packagers. So why don't you start with a quick overview of your conversation with Dr. Post, some of the really high level takeaways that you had with him.
You, you bet. And I've known him for 15 years or so, and he's a private consultant now, but spent many years in a variety of roles within the government. He's the one who taught me, raised my consciousness years ago to the importance of these dietary guidelines for Americans. And the point that he emphasized is that very few people, certainly consumers, maybe even people in industry, really pay close attention to these dietary guidelines, but they are an enormously important driver of trends and developments and fads and alterations of different kinds in food products, simply because they provide an outline of approach for government programs involving food. So they do affect directly SNAP, used to be called food stamps and military meals. And, uh, uh, anytime the government is providing a meal program, the dietary guidelines are the guidance that they follow. And but beyond that, and sort of for our purposes, more relevantly, it drives consumer preference, it drives industry trends and tendencies in terms of product formulation, and of course, label claims and advertising claims about their content. So uh, it so little known though it may be, it's an important driver of a lot of changes. We can talk about what we think the most recent set of changes might be.
Good, yeah, and that's sort of where we live in packaging world is what's the actual physical manifestation of these changes on pack, on label.
Right.
So like at a high level, again, we're starting at a high level, sort of like the inverted food pyramid that we're going to be discussing. We start wide and narrow down a little bit as we go.
Yeah.
So the question is, why should packaging teams and brand owners pay attention to the dietary guidelines for Americans, even though they're really technically like nutrition policy and not packaging regulations?
Well, I mean, I can think of two ways that they can end up influencing consumer product packaged foods. One is obviously claims of content on labeling, uh, and uh, and the other, of course, is reformulation to make your product able to make a claim on labeling. And the reason that these changes would be driven is I think true now more than ever because of social media, that consumers will start to look for and demand products with, for example, higher protein content, less sugar, even some saturated fat, all things that the new dietary guidelines are kind of pointing people toward. And once consumers start to demand these things, I think manufacturers and brands are going to say to themselves, well, I want to satisfy that demand, so I'm going to reformulate or I'm going to make more front of pack claims about my protein content or some other feature of the product.
Okay. Yeah. Well, you mentioned a key word there in saturated fat, in that the new DGA, you and Dr. Post discussed this in your columns, places some renewed emphasis on protein and what they call healthy fasts. So, from again, trying to keep this from a packaging and labeling perspective, how does that shift influence, kind of the claims or on-pack messaging brands might want to explore that they might not have wanted to explore previously
Yeah.
when fats were a dirty word?
Well, that's a good point. And part of what we have to acknowledge is I think if you read through the guidelines, which are only about 9, 10 pages long, there's a lot of messages that are absolutely consistent with past messages you've heard about diet and nutrition. And the one that gets called out as something new and different is this essentially, clearing the way for you to eat some saturated fat once in a while or full fat dairy products as opposed to skim, or reduced fat. It's a little confusing though, because at the same time, the guidelines say you should only be getting about 10% of your diet from saturated fat. And from my own point of view, and we'll take a look at the graphic, it's got meat and poultry at the top of the pyramid, on the wide part of the pyramid. I think that's conveying you should eat the most of those things, but that's not what the guidelines really call for. So the graphic to me is confusing when set side by the actual advice. But there isn't any question that they want to convey that it's okay to have some saturated fat in your diet, whereas previously I think the advice might have been try to avoid it altogether.
Good. And for those listening, not viewing, you should be able to see that inverted food pyramid. It used to be the traditional pyramid, now inverted. You should be able to see that at the DGA website. It's actually all over health, what is it, the HHA and so on. Should be easy to find to help illustrate.
Right.
Now, you mentioned again, previous versions of this were 60 pages or so. This is only, you said this is shorter. It's like 9, 10 pages.
Yeah.
How does that clear consumer messaging? I mean, does that make it simpler for consumers to understand, thus make the consumer messaging on pack slightly different or more narrow or easier to understand? Does it make it easier to
Yeah.
narrow down your messaging on that package in a smaller format?
Uh, Obviously, the shorter the message, the easier it'll be to maybe to convey it and also to make reference to it on a food label. The confusing elements of it that I'm referring to make that a little harder. But I don't think there's any question, and this was announced ahead of time by RFK Jr., that the new guidelines were going to be shorter than what they've become in the past. And they are backed up by appendices and sort of background documents about the science that supports them. But the document itself, the DGA document of guidance, is only 10 pages, where in past years it's been tens and tens of pages long. I can't disagree that, shorter is better if you're trying to convey a simple set of guidelines to that the public can understand and follow.
Yeah. Now, one notable change you and Dr. Post both highlight is not just what to eat, but there's recommendations to avoid, not just limit, but
Yeah,
avoid highly processed foods. And of course, that's kind of a squishy definition of what highly processed food means, but mostly I think that it generally means added sugar, added sodium, that sort of thing. So, what does that signal to brands when they're thinking about package design, ingredients
right.
lists? That 20, 15 years ago, we were always talking about, the shorter ingredient list, the better. And this sounds to comport with that. And
It does. Yeah,
front of pack communication too,
yeah,
messaging.
yeah. You're quite right. And part of what makes the effectiveness of these guidelines a little uncertain at this point is there are other efforts already underway that will have the same effect of driving consumer interest and demand. One is the definition of the term ultra processed. I believe the dietary guidelines use the phrase heavily processed, but they're still futtering around trying to get public input and figure out what they want to define as ultra processed foods. There are some other definitions from other bodies and worldwide about what it does and doesn't mean. The whole the whole effort is essentially designed to kind of stigmatize a whole category of foods, and try to drive consumer demand, away from them. But that hasn't been completed. So now you have these dietary guidelines for Americans that do say something about processed foods, but they don't have the definition in place where they can tell you with certainty what they expect you to do about them or to how much to avoid them. The other thing that's also in process you just mentioned is some sort of really abbreviated summary, of the nutritional value of a food on the front of pack. And so I think all of those things, once they're finalized, will work together and maybe help shape some of the demand from consumers and some of the net demands from industry as they reformulate, or um, some products won't need to reformulate. They'll just tout, the fact that they are low in sugar or low in sodium, or what have you, or high
I
in
can think of
protein. Protein is a very big emphasis, from a variety of sources in the new dietary guidelines. That's the claim that I think we'll expect to see called out most commonly, or at least in the near future, a lot of claims about high in protein.
Yeah, and some of them, the claim being, we've always been like this.
Right, right.
This has always been we're not changing a thing, and we're still matching, what the new regulations are. But there is a subset, and not a small subset of brands affected by this, where the guidelines are going to have to make them start to rethink about formulations and then messaging those formulations on
Yes,
pack. So I guess you mentioned this in your preamble too, when you kind of were giving us the overview. These types of guidelines, even though they're not well known to consumers, they really do drive. They're kind of underpinning of what's driving product innovation and what's changing.
correct.
So kind of looking back from what you've seen historically, kind of rear view mirror perspective, how does that innovation eventually translate into changes in, let's say, packaging materials, formats, label strategies, that sort of thing?
Well, the label strategies we've talked about a little bit. I think you'll see products uh, touting their features of their product in ways that match up with what people are looking for because of the DGA. The other thing I think you probably can expect on, if it's snack foods, is maybe new package sizes, namely smaller, perhaps, so that they can avoid falling into categories uh, of providing too much of nutrients and food components that they don't want to provide too much. And one way to do that is smaller portion size. Now, it's funny that the DGA makes mention of, keep track of your portions, don't have too much. There's a lot of theorists about what's wrong with the American diet who think that in many ways it really mostly comes down to portion size, because you can have some saturated fat in your diet, you can have some salt, you can have some sugar, just not too much is sort of what you hear people say very often. And in many ways, you can control against a lot of these things by just eating smaller portions. This is my completely amateurish personal view of the whole diet and health issue. Uh, Portion size might be the number one factor.
But
That,
nothing
that's
impacts
just me.
packaging more. I mean, that is a huge, unless you're talking about shrinkflation and putting fewer chips in the same size bag,
Yeah.
then that is an inherently packaging oriented
It,
effect of the new DGA.
yes, it would be. And I mean, I leave it to the creative minds in the world of food marketing to come up with things like reconfiguring product, not just size and portion size, but product form in some ways, to try to accommodate some of these new motivations that consumers are going to have.
And just kind of off the top of my head, I can think of some of the sort of healthy snacking combo packs that we've seen out there with, nuts and some small amount of protein, some
Right.
small amount of cheeses and so on. And I could imagine there's certain fixed sizes to those, say, thermoform cups or polypropylene cups. I could imagine those potentially changing to hew to what the recommendations are on this DGA. So that's sort of like a what we've seen change before based on DGA. Looking ahead to 2030, so right now we're speaking at the very beginning of 2026. So what's your takeaway for brands and CPGs? How should packaging th teams think about the DGA as a long-term driver rather than a one-time every so often incremental policy update?
That's a pretty good question. My inclination is to say, people are experts in marketing for a reason, and because they have knowledge and expertise that I don't claim to have. But it strikes me though that I think that consumer preference is going to drive a lot of this, so that they may be surveying and doing focus groups and so on. You're a consumer of our product. What is your reaction to the message or messages coming from the new DGA, and see if it inspires them to want to make changes to their products. I think the biggest, things that the new DGA turns on its head from the past is, uh, uh, saturated fat is not taboo anymore. Sources of protein should be more emphasized, and reduce sugar in particular, but also sodium and saturated fat. How those get translated into product development, remains to be seen. But I think some of what we talked about today is going to be, you'll see it if it's not already starting to show up on the shelf. I think it will.
Sure. Good. All right. Well, we're just about out of time. I want to make sure if there's anything I'm missing that really stood out from you and Dr. Post's conversations, any big takeaways that you have that we might not have touched on or I might not have asked about?
Well, there was one point that he said when we had our discussion before the DGA came out. He said, "My hope is whatever they come up with is supported by strong science." And
Is
when
it?
the kind of. Some parts are, and some parts are not. And he commented that he expects the government officials will continue to study the issues that are not currently supported by science in a way that generates and develops the scientific support for those things. We'll see if that turns out to be the case. I don't think there's much disagreement that the American diet is of lower quality than it could be. That certain changes could be warranted. It's just how you get there, is the subject of a lot more disagreement. So we'll see what this can do for us. Ideally, the recommendations and all of the recommendations in the guidance are there because there's if not a consensus, something close to it among the relevant nutritionists and scientists, that it's useful, advice. If you're including advice that isn't quite at that level of proof, it remains to be seen whether it'll have the intended effect of improving the diet. So,
Got it. Yeah, I guess the proof will be in the pudding,
yeah.
but let's say low sugar pudding in this case. So great, Eric. Thanks. That's just about all the time we have for today. My audience, you can keep up with what Eric's thinking and watching in the whole packaging landscape, both from a legal and labeling perspective, on his legal side column in Packaging World Magazine, amongst many other places. Eric, where can our audience of mostly brands and CPGs find you should they need to engage you further?
Well, we've got a website, www.ericfgreenbergpc.com. And we post our Packaging World columns there, and there's some other materials and resources and an ability to contact us there on
Good,
that site. Thank you.
good, good. Well, thanks to our audience who've joined today, and we will see you next time. We'll keep in touch with Eric on all of the machinations of labeling and food labeling and packaging in the U.S. So thanks, Eric, and thanks to our audience. See you next time.
Thanks.